This recording must never exist. That's what the letter said. Handwritten, no return address, no signature, just 4 words scribbled across the bottom in dried red ink. They are not human. In 1878, a small farming town in Kansas vanished from the map. Officially, it still exists. Unofficially, it was erased. Not just by time, but by design. Sealed away in silence by the Kansas Medical Board, censored from the archives of the Methodist Church, and omitted from every historical registry past 1901. Why? Because of 4 brothers: Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, Abel, the Blackwoods, and what they became. Science calls them an anomaly. Theology calls them an abomination. But those who lived through that summer in Cedar Ridge whispered a different word: exchange. It began with faith. It ended in something far older, something no one, not even the church, could sanctify. When the fever came, the rest of the town died screaming. But the Blackwoods thrived, unburnt, uninfected, unchanged, until they weren't. Their eyes reflected light like nocturnal animals, their voices harmonized in tones that made ears bleed, and by winter their shadows no longer obeyed the sun. But the real horror wasn't what they became, it was what they willingly invited in. This story has been suppressed for nearly 150 years. The final physician who examined them, Dr. Samuel Morrison, died institutionalized, mumbling in extinct languages and clawing his own skin, whispering over and over, "They said yes, they said yes." Tonight, I'm going to show you why this story was buried, why Harvard refuses to analyze the surviving DNA samples, why the Smithsonian labeled their belongings culturally contaminant, and why no official document dares to classify what the Blackwood brothers truly were. But know this: what you're about to hear can't be unheard. Once you step into that chapel, you don't come back the same. They say Kansas is flat, but out there, past where the roads end and the prairie swallows the horizon, there are places the earth still remembers, places that haven't forgotten the blood soaked into their soil. Cedar Ridge was one of them. A dot on the map, erased not by accident, but by necessity. Not because of what it had, but because of what it birthed. In 1872, the Blackwood brothers arrived with nothing but faith and silence. 4 men bound by blood, by scripture, and by a hunger they didn't yet understand. Ezra, the eldest, quiet as stone, with eyes like winter frost. Caleb, the rational one, calculating, deliberate, obsessed with divine mathematics. Josiah, educated, learned, but twisted inward by what he called revelation. And Abel, the youngest, the most dangerous, not because he was evil, but because he was pure. They claimed to worship the God of Abraham, but their God didn't live in the sky. He lived in the limestone chapel they built with their own hands, each block soaked in prayer, each inscription copied from scrolls no preacher in Kansas had ever seen, Hebrew, Aramaic, and something older, something unpronounceable. They lived apart from the town, not because they were feared, but because they feared what lived inside everyone else. To the outside world, they were model citizens, honest, hard-working, tireless. But to those who got too close, something always felt wrong. Conversations with them felt like confessions. They never blinked at the same time. Their answers were too perfect, and their stares, those eyes, felt like judgment etched from another realm. Then the fever came. Typhoid, they said, but it wasn't. It was faster, more violent. The sick didn't just burn, they spoke in languages their tongues shouldn't have known. Children recited dead dialects, farmers screamed psalms backwards, twins died in unison, whispering harmonies that bled from their mouths. And yet, the Blackwoods walked among the dying like immune angels, not one symptom, not one fever, not one moment of fear. At first, the town thought it was divine favor. Then, they saw the change. Ezra's shadow detached during sunset, drifting west when the sun fell east. Josiah's breath formed symbols in frost that lingered on walls for hours. Caleb's voice began splitting, two tones at once, one in English, the other something older than language. And Abel? Abel didn't speak at all. He just smiled, like he finally understood the price of their prayer. Dr. Samuel Morrison kept 3 journals, one for official medical records, one for personal observations, and one he buried behind his house beneath a false stone marked Psalm 88:18. Darkness is my closest friend. That 3rd journal was never meant for human eyes, because what he wrote in it wasn't medicine, it was warning. By August 12th, the death toll in Cedar Ridge had reached 27. The disease moved like it had intelligence. It didn't spread through contact. It selected entire families untouched, while single individuals collapsed mid-prayer, mid-breath, mid-sentence. And always, before the fever took hold, they heard voices in dreams, in wind, in water. Dr. Morrison began to notice a pattern, not in the victims, but in their final words. Each spoke of the chapel on the hill. Each described 4 lights in the field. Each said the same phrase before death: they are preparing. He didn't understand it, not yet, but he knew something was feeding on the town, something that didn't care for science or sanitation, something that answered prayer. That's when he turned his attention to the Blackwood brothers. On August 14th, Josiah invited him to the chapel. No townsfolk had ever been allowed inside. The invitation came with no emotion, just a calm statement. You must see the altar. Against his better judgment, Morrison went. What he found inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. The walls were etched, not painted, with inscriptions so intricate they shimmered under candlelight. The altar was limestone but blackened at the edges as if singed by fire. And at the center of it all, a book, hand-bound, skin leather, unlabeled. It was not a Bible. Josiah placed a hand on the book and said only one sentence: "This is not worship, it is agreement." Dr. Morrison asked what he meant. Josiah replied, "The fever is not a curse, it is filtration, it burns away the unnecessary, like dross from gold." On the 3rd night after his visit, Dr. Morrison awoke to symbols carved into his bedroom ceiling, symbols he had seen in the chapel but never touched. His dreams turned violent. The wind outside began speaking his name, and always, he woke to the smell of smoke and the faint sound of 4 voices singing in perfect hollow harmony. He began to understand. This was never typhoid. It was selection. The Methodist Church held its final sermon on August 19, 1878. By then, over 40 had died. The pews were mostly empty. The hymns were sung off-key, fractured by fear. Reverend Jacob Ellsworth stood before a dwindling flock and read from Revelation, but his hands shook. His voice faltered. He had seen something the night before, something in the wheat fields. He never said what. He just stopped preaching midway through a verse and muttered, "We've been abandoned." Then he walked out, left his Bible on the pulpit, never returned. 2 days later, the Blackwoods returned to town. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They simply walked into the Hartman home, where the last surviving child, Lillian, lay dying. 8 years old, skin like parchment, breathing shallow. Her father, Benjamin, could do nothing but cry. Ezra laid his hand on the girl's chest, closed his eyes, whispered something, too soft to hear, but sharp enough to silence the wind. The moment his fingers touched her skin, the room went cold, so cold the oil lamp flickered out. When it relit itself, without a hand to touch it, Lillian sat up, alive, breathing, eyes wide with something that wasn't gratitude, something far older. She looked directly at her father and spoke a single sentence: "The sacrifice has been received." From that day forward, she never slept. She never aged. Her skin remained cold to the touch, like stone left in shade. Her voice, once high and innocent, grew melodic, dual-toned, like she spoke in duet with something hiding behind her breath. Benjamin fled the town 3 nights later, left Lillian behind. His wagon was found overturned 15 miles south, his body torn open, not by animal claws, but by something precise, surgical. inverted. The townspeople began to whisper that the Blackwoods had struck a bargain, that their immunity wasn't protection, it was payment, that the chapel wasn't a place of prayer, but of exchange. They avoided the farm, the hill, even the roads that ran near it. But by then, it didn't matter. The brothers had begun appearing in their dreams, standing in corners, singing in languages no man was meant to know, and always with that same hollow harmony. 4 voices, one purpose. Not to heal, to prepare. It was around this time that the livestock began to change. First, it was the cattle, calm beasts suddenly refusing to graze near the chapel hill. They stood motionless, staring toward the limestone building for hours at a time. Then the birds vanished. Every sparrow, every crow, every hawk that once patrolled the Kansas skies simply stopped flying over Cedar Ridge. The prairie turned silent. Even the insects disappeared. Farmers found their chickens dead in coops. No wounds, no signs of illness, just cold, stiff bodies with their beaks open as if frozen mid-scream. The Patterson family awoke one morning to find their hogs standing in a perfect circle, faces toward the sun, unblinking, unmoving, until one by one they dropped dead simultaneously, no cause determined. It was Josiah who offered the explanation, not to the town, but to his own brothers. "Creation is responding," he said, tracing a spiral in the dust with his finger, "not resisting, aligning. The unnatural harmony of the world before Eden fell." That same week, Dr. Morrison broke. He was found wandering barefoot down the center of Main Street, muttering to himself, arms marked with self-inflicted carvings, runes no one recognized. He was taken in by townsfolk and confined to a makeshift infirmary. There, he repeated one phrase over and over, sometimes whispering, sometimes screaming, "They aren't men. They never were." His notes, the ones he hadn't burned, were recovered, pages filled with anatomy sketches that didn't match human physiology, diagrams of vocal cords stretched in impossible directions, eyes that had no pupils, just mirrored surfaces that reflected no light source. He claimed the brothers had no fingerprints, that their blood didn't clot, that beneath their skin was a network of fibers he called salmaline, organic filaments that vibrated during prayer. He wrote that Abel hadn't eaten food in over 40 days, that he'd simply sit in the chapel, weeping blood, hands uplifted, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Morrison's last recorded entry ended mid-sentence. "The chapel was not built, it was unearthed. The altar is not for worship, it is for..." The ink trails off the page. That night, someone tried to burn the chapel. No one ever admitted to it, but the blackened grass leading from the main road told the story. The fire didn't reach the door. The wind turned against it, as if something inside refused to be silenced. It wasn't just the town that changed. It was time itself. People began losing hours. Whole afternoons vanished without memory. A farmer would look up from his plow at midday, and suddenly the moon was overhead. Mothers heard their children speaking to people who weren't there. Men woke with dirt under their nails and no recollection of where they'd been. The town clock, once perfectly reliable, began ticking backwards at dusk, just for a few minutes, just long enough for everyone to notice and deny. But the Blackwoods, they were never confused. In fact, they began working at night. Neighbors, what few remained, saw torchlight moving through the wheat fields at impossible hours. Chanting echoed across the prairie, rhythmic, cold, harmonized. Sometimes it came from the chapel, other times from beneath it. Because by now the Blackwood farm wasn't just a homestead. It was a boundary, a membrane, a place where what's below touches what's above, and something had begun to cross. Caleb was the first to show signs of irreversible change. His voice became permanently doubled, 2 frequencies riding the same breath. He no longer blinked. His skin became smooth, poreless, almost waxen. He could recite entire passages of scripture backwards, flawlessly. Josiah stopped sleeping. He didn't rest, didn't blink, didn't eat, just studied. Dozens of books filled his quarters, some no one could identify, written in scripts that slithered across the page. Ezra had begun walking the perimeter of their land each morning at 3:33 a.m. barefoot, regardless of weather. Locals who saw him said he didn't leave tracks, and when he passed by their windows, dogs wouldn't bark. They would whimper or go completely silent, as if commanded. But Abel was no longer speaking. He only sang, low, droning harmonies just above human hearing, sometimes alone, sometimes in response to something, echoing back. Witnesses said the sound made their ears ring for days. One hired hand said he heard words in the vibrations, words he didn't understand but still felt ashamed for hearing. Then came the night of August 29th, when a storm rolled in with no clouds, just wind and light and sound. For 3 hours the sky above Cedar Ridge glowed a color no one could name, and during that time every mirror in the town cracked simultaneously. Those who looked into the broken glass didn't see their own reflections. They saw the chapel. From the inside, something ancient had taken notice. Not a spirit, not a demon, not something you could cast out with Latin or salt. This was older, colder, a force that didn't care if you believed in it. It only cared if you listened. On the first day of September, 3 children went missing. No signs of struggle, no footprints, doors locked from the inside. But in each empty bed, a symbol was burned into the sheets, spiraled, symmetrical, pulsing with some kind of residue that made lanterns dim and the air smell like wet stone. Their names were never recorded in the official reports, just 3 lines of omission. Dr. Morrison, still locked in his own fevered madness, whispered their names repeatedly, names no one had told him, names written backward in his blood against the walls of his infirmary cell. The physician was no longer treating the epidemic. He was studying the chapel, drawing it from memory, recreating its geometry over and over. One of the nurses noticed something impossible. Every angle of the chapel he sketched added up to more than 360 degrees. The structure obeyed a geometry that defied reality. It bent space, stretched logic. It wasn't just a building, it was an anchor. Ezra confirmed it days later in a conversation overheard by the storekeeper's wife, who never spoke again after what she heard. He told Josiah plainly, calmly, "The altar doesn't point upward, it points inward." The brothers began bringing soil into the chapel, buckets of it, carefully sifted from specific areas of their land. No one knew why, until the dream started again. Cedar Ridge residents reported seeing tunnels beneath the prairie, root-like structures, pulsing, breathing, and at the center, 4 figures standing in a circle, eyes closed, humming in tones that rattled the dreamer's bones. And then came the animals. Not the dead ones, the ones that returned. Cattle thought buried beg, and to appear again in the fields, marked, changed, their bodies reshaped in small but undeniable ways, extra joints, teeth filed flat, eyes glazed over with a silvery membrane that reflected starlight even during the day. When one was cut open, its organs had fused into a single mass, beating, humming, harmonizing with the sound coming from the chapel hill. This wasn't transformation anymore, it was replication. On the night of September 6th, the town finally acted. A group of 9 men, farmers, laborers, even the sheriff himself, gathered at the old schoolhouse. No written plans, no names recorded, just one shared understanding. The Blackwoods had to be stopped. Whatever they were doing on that hill, it wasn't human, it wasn't holy, and it was spreading. They waited until the hour between dusk and dark, the time Josiah once called the thinning. Each man brought something sacred, a Bible, a crucifix. One man carried his grandmother's rosary, another brought his daughter's first tooth, wrapped in linen, whispered over for protection. They didn't return, not all at once. The next morning, only one came back. Thomas Avery, the butcher. He was found sitting on the steps of the Methodist church, completely naked, skin covered in blood that wasn't his. His hands had been shattered, each finger bent backwards at the knuckle. He was smiling. When Reverend Ellsworth, who had come out of hiding only that morning, asked what happened, Avery whispered, "They didn't resist. They invited us, and we said yes." He died 3 hours later. No wounds, no fever, just silence, as if something had finished using him and moved on. That was the last time anyone in Cedar Ridge attempted to confront the brothers directly. The rest of the town began to fracture, not from violence, but from withdrawal. People stopped leaving their homes, children were kept from windows, conversations grew hushed, reverent, like chapel whispers. The town existed in a suspended breath, waiting, and the Blackwoods, they didn't hide. They walked the roads openly. They stood outside homes without knocking. They appeared inside barns without opening the doors. Their presence was no longer secret. It was sovereign. They were becoming something else, and they wanted the town to see it. But what terrified people most was the way time bent around them. Watches stopped. Clocks ticked sideways. One man reported seeing Abel walk through a hailstorm, each piece of ice hovering in place around his body, unmoving, like time refused to touch him. A girl swore she saw Josiah enter the general store and exit before the door had finished opening. Reality was soft around them now, malleable, obedient. They weren't men. They were becoming a choir. September 9th. The wind stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Every weather vane in Cedar Ridge froze in place. Every leaf held still in mid-air like the world had hit pause. Birds perched without blinking, insects clung to window panes in perfect silence, and in that unnatural stillness, the chapel door opened. No one saw it, but everyone felt it. The dreams returned that night, stronger, sharper, no longer symbolic, now instructional. Townspeople woke up with soil beneath their fingernails, mud on their boots they hadn't worn in days. Some found new scars. Others found old wounds healed, completely, unnaturally, without pain or process. One woman gave birth to a child 3 months premature. The infant emerged with its eyes wide open, pale and reflective, already tracking movement. It never cried, it only watched. When the doctor tried to examine it, he began bleeding from his ears. He fled the room and hanged himself in the woods 2 days later. Back at the chapel, the brothers had changed their routine. They no longer attended their farm. They no longer harvested, no longer prayed in silence. They sang, all day, all night. A rising, resonating harmonic that began low enough to be missed, then grew until it vibrated through the wheat stalks and into the soil. The town said it made their bones ache, their teeth loosen, their dreams bleed into waking hours. Those few brave enough to approach the Blackwood property said the air shimmered, that the chapel glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The front door never moved, but figures were seen inside, walking in spirals, tracing symbols in the dust with bare feet. No one saw their faces, only their silhouettes, elongated, as if something was stretching them upward, calling them into another shape. And then one night, the song stopped. Mid-note. Silence. Every window in Cedar Ridge shattered simultaneously. No wind. No quake. Just sound. Impossible. Deafening. Internal. Residents screamed in pain, clutching their heads as something passed through them. When it ended, the chapel stood open, the door wide, the altar exposed. Inside, townspeople said they saw a mirror, but not made of glass, a liquid surface, black, endless, reflecting not their faces but their possibilities, versions of themselves that had made different choices, versions that had said yes. The chapel wasn't a place of worship, it was a threshold, and something had stepped across. September 13th, 1878, the final date in Dr. Morrison's recovered journal. His last entry reads, "They are no longer separate, not from each other, not from it. The choir has found its voice, and we are the song. That was the day Cedar Ridge vanished from U.S. postal maps. Not destroyed, not abandoned, erased. The records didn't burn, they simply unexisted. County maps redrew their borders. Letters addressed to Cedar Ridge were returned marked no such town. Railroad routes bent away from it without explanation. Travelers passed through the area and reported only empty plains. Locals who had family there began to forget names, forget birthdays, forget blood. It was as if the town had never been, but it had. And something stayed behind. The Blackwood land still exists, buried now under layers of false history, renamed, sold, resold, forgotten. But the chapel, no one ever found it again. Not because it was destroyed, but because it went inward. The threshold collapsed, sealed by the same unnatural harmony that had opened it, a frequency beyond human perception, except to those who've heard it before. And sometimes people do. They report the same things, 4 figures in dreams, voices humming at the edge of sleep, spirals appearing in frost, in ash, in bone, a name whispered in impossible places. Blackwood, not a surname, a signal, because the choir never died. It moved. Every generation someone hears it, someone answers, and slowly the spiral turns again. Ask around in the forgotten corners, the towns with one road in and none out, the churches with no crosses, the farms where the wind never moves and the birds don't sing. Listen closely on the nights without stars. You might hear it. That low, hollow harmony. 4 voices, one purpose, not to destroy, to prepare. They say sound never truly dies. It ripples, fades, waits, and sometimes it returns. In 1936, a surveyor named Kenneth Rourke passed through central Kansas. He was cataloging soil conditions for a railway expansion. On his 3rd day, his instruments failed. Compasses spun, ground-penetrating sensors gave conflicting depths. He made camp near a grove of dead wheat and reported hearing singing beneath the earth. He left the next morning, but not before he sketched what he saw in the dew on his tent flap. A chapel, a spiral, and 4 silhouettes standing in silence, waiting for the wind to start again. That sketch ended up archived in a collection of anomalous rural folklore until it was quietly pulled in 1982 by an undisclosed group. The file was stamped with 3 red words: phonic resonance hazard. And then, nothing, until last year, when a hiker in Kansas recorded a sound on their phone, barely audible at first, a low, layered hum, 4 tones, rising and falling, almost melodic. The clip went viral briefly, dismissed as wind through the grain. But those who knew, those who remembered the old stories, the hushed rumors of a town that wasn't a town anymore, they recognized the harmony, and they stopped listening, because that sound, buried in static, drifting through frequencies and centuries, isn't just a melody, it's a message, a preparation, and it's getting louder. This is where we leave Cedar Ridge. But the Blackwood brothers are not finished. Their story stretches into the future, into your time, into you. What happened in Cedar Ridge wasn't an isolated haunting, it wasn't demonic, it wasn't divine, it was something far older than our language for good and evil, something that does not invade, it invites. The Blackwood brothers didn't summon a god, they remembered one, or worse, were remembered by one. And in that remembering, the world bent, time thinned, and something stepped closer. We like to believe history is linear, that the past is buried, the present is safe, and the future is ours to shape. But some truths don't stay buried, some doors don't stay closed, and some names don't stay forgotten. You've heard one of them tonight. Blackwood. A name that hums beneath the surface of maps. A name that calls from chapel ruins and broken timepieces. A name that waits to be spoken by the right voice at the wrong moment. And if that moment ever comes, if you find yourself standing on land that feels too still, if the wind won't move, If the mirrors no longer reflect you, then it's already too late. Because the choir is never gone. It is patient, it is tuning, and it is always listening. No official record of Cedar Ridge exists in Kansas State Archives. No census data, no deeds, no obituaries. It's as if the land was always empty. But in 1971, a geology student at the University of Kansas submitted a senior thesis that mentioned a peculiar region in McPherson County, a stretch of farmland where magnetic readings became erratic. Soil samples taken from that area contained microscopic iron spirals, naturally occurring in no other documented location. The paper was rejected. The student, Michael Trent, went missing 6 months later. His last known correspondence was a letter to his professor. It read, "The earth here is shallow. I think something is still breathing underneath. The sound changes when I sleep." Enclosed in the envelope was a small, charcoal sketch. 4 figures, standing at the edge of a chapel with no door, looking out. You can ignore these kinds of stories. Write them off as folklore, dismiss them as fiction for the fearful. But just remember this: a town doesn't need to exist on a map to leave a mark. A chapel doesn't need walls to become sacred, and a song, once heard, can never be unheard, especially when it's in your blood, especially when it's not finished. Because somewhere, right now, a child is humming in their sleep. A mirror is warping in a forgotten farmhouse, and a name is being spoken in the quiet corners of your mind. Blackwood. There is no file, there is no agency, no black site, no foundation, no basement in Langley cataloguing this. But there is a pattern. It appears in the margins of burned church ledgers, in the footnotes of abandoned psychiatric evaluations, in the static between shortwave frequencies, in dreams collected, catalogued, and suppressed by those who know what they mean. They call it the spiral archive. A network of occurrences, never officially linked, marked by the same symbols, the same sounds, the same impossible geometry. 78, the Blackwood Brothers in Kansas. 1894, the Bone Choir Mass in a Welsh mining town. In 22, the Carmichael Convergence in rural Virginia. 955, the Stillborn Sermon at St. Ligea's in Argentina. 2019, the Signal Orchard near Omak, Washington. 5 locations, 5 manifestations, 5 thresholds. But one voice. The Spiral Archive was never published, never aired. It exists in whispers, digitized, redacted, stolen, scattered across encrypted files and broken servers. Until now. Because someone, maybe you, has started pulling the thread. And the deeper you go, the more it sings back. The first sign wasn't the bleeding sky. It was the silence of the bells. St. Luke's Church had rung its morning chime every Sunday since 1873. Rain or shine, war or famine. But on July the 2nd, 1922, the bells didn't ring. The ropes were intact, the clapper untouched, but the metal was warm to the touch, like it had been pulled from a furnace. Inside, Reverend Elijah Carmichael stood at the pulpit, eyes closed, hands clasped behind his back. The congregation waited. No one spoke. No one coughed. No one shifted in their pews. Witnesses said it felt like time had stopped. That's when the humming began. Low, directionless, not from a single mouth, but from everywhere. It rose from the wood grain, from beneath the floorboards, from inside the lungs of every man, woman, and child in the church. The Reverend opened his eyes and said just one word: finally. Over the following weeks, the town of Wakefield Hollow changed, not in ways you'd see, not right away, but dogs stopped barking, children no longer cried, and every morning a fresh loaf of bread appeared at each doorstep, still warm, unsliced, and marked with a spiral scored into its crust. The baker swore he hadn't made them. The town physician, Dr. Eloise Hart, noted a disturbing trend. Patients reported a clarity, a vanishing of nightmares, of regret, of guilt. They spoke with calm, glassy eyes about letting go of the past, about becoming clean. But their pupils were dilated, their heartbeats slower than normal, their speech almost melodic. She kept detailed notes. On the night of July the 21st, she locked herself in her clinic and tried to radio for help. The only words received by nearby stations were, "They're tuning us, like strings, and I'm almost in key." She was never seen again. This is not just another possession, not another cult, not a mass delusion. This is a continuation, a new verse in a song that began beneath the soil of Kansas. The choir has moved east, and in Wakefield Hollow, Virginia, they've begun to teach the congregation to sing. There are no photographs of Reverend Elijah Carmichael before 1922, no birth certificate, no seminary record, no mention in any diocese ledger across Virginia or the Carolinas. But those who lived in Wakefield Hollow remembered his arrival. They said he walked out of the woods barefoot, his clothes soaked with morning dew, his Bible dry. He spoke plainly, never raised his voice, never smiled. But when he touched your hand, a warmth ran up your spine, not comforting, not familiar, just ancient. By spring, he had restored St. Luke's single-handedly, cleaned, repainted, rebuilt its crumbling steeple. And by summer, the pews were full. People didn't remember why they started coming. They just came, and they listened. Because Carmichael didn't preach. Not really, he recited. Long, rhythmic passages that didn't match any scripture, phrases that repeated with slight variations, like verses evolving as they were spoken. Sometimes he would pause mid-sermon and hum a single note, and every head in the church would tilt in unison. One man later confessed to a traveling journalist, "We weren't listening to him. We were listening through him." Then the dreams began. First, it was just the children. They described a spiral staircase made of wheat, a woman in red robes whose face never turned, and a single note, held so long it bled into silence. Then the adults followed. They began sleepwalking into the woods, their eyes always open, their voices humming. One mother was found standing in the river at dawn, whispering a hymn in perfect reverse. She had never learned to read, and always, they described the same thing when they woke. A great chapel, not built of wood or stone, but sound. A place that couldn't be seen, only remembered. And at its center, 4 empty thrones, waiting. Whatever came to Wakefield Hollow didn't need to knock. The door had already been opened, in Kansas. And now the choir had found a mouthpiece. By August of 1922, the town doctor was gone. The sheriff had vanished into the woods, his badge left nailed to the chapel door, and St. Luke's had stopped ringing its bells. Because it no longer needed to call anyone, they were already listening, and they were changing. It began in the skin. Rings of bruising appeared around the spines of the townsfolk, symmetrical, precise, painless. Infants born in Wakefield Hollow were delivered without cries, without blood. Each had a faint spiral etched beneath the left ear, raised slightly, like a birthmark that hummed when touched. The blacksmith, a man named Garrett Eames, was found standing naked in his forge, his palms pressed against the coals. He was smiling, not in rapture, in recognition. He said only, "The song makes the heat. Feel like home." Then came the day of glass. Witnesses, what few there were, reported that every mirror, window and reflective surface in Wakefield Hollow cracked at the same moment, not shattered, fractured inward, as if something was trying to pull out of the reflections, something hungry, something familiar. In the chapel, Reverend Carmichael was no longer alone. 4 parishioners stood at the altar, not moving, not speaking, each with their mouths sewn shut, not by thread, but by skin itself. They were the new choir, The thrones were no longer empty, and from them the sound deepened. Not just heard, but felt. A vibration in the bones, a resonance behind the eyes. Visitors described it as both beautiful and unbearable. Some tried to stop it. One man, a WWI veteran named Thomas Llewellyn, marched into the chapel with a revolver and a crucifix. He didn't make it 5 steps. He began to sing. Whatever Carmichael brought wasn't possession. It wasn't cultic. It was evolutionary. Wakefield Hollow wasn't being taken. It was being retuned. August 28, 1922. Wakefield Hollow was there. August 29th. Gone. Not destroyed. Not burned. Just missing. State surveyors arrived that morning to assess a possible dam site along the South Fork Rivanna River. What they found, or didn't find, made no sense. The road that once led into town ended abruptly in a thicket of red cedar and dust. No structures, no ruins, no graves. But here's the catch. Their maps still showed Wakefield Hollow. Homes, streets, elevations, population 481. Even more unsettling, the men reported a sound in the air, sub-audible but thick, like standing in a room with a tuning fork pressed to the walls. One of them, Henry Maslow, left the site early. Days later, he mailed his resignation letter, written in block letters with no punctuation. We were not supposed to see the empty place. It is not empty. They are not gone. They are below it now. The Bureau of Investigation, not yet the FBI, quietly opened case file number 717 Vox. The lead agent assigned, Miriam Alcott, was a linguist with a background in code breaking. She spent 2 weeks combing nearby towns, interviewing anyone who remembered Wakefield Hollow. Most didn't. Those who did described memories with large blank spaces, like stories with pages torn out. One elderly farmer claimed, they were a quiet people, kind, never gossiped, but the moment you stepped onto their land, you stopped thinking about yourself. Alcott's final report was sealed with an unusual classification: phonetic exclusion perimeter activated, a term used only once in Bureau history, her last personal journal entry before being transferred to a psychiatric facility in Maryland. It's not a town, it's a resonance chamber. They built a place for it to grow. And now it doesn't need walls. Wakefield Hollow wasn't lost. It graduated from location to frequency, from community to conduit, and the choir, still very much alive. You just have to listen to the right silence. No one knows who recorded it. The wax cylinder was found in 1943, sealed inside a tin box buried beneath the floorboards of a burned-out train depot near Roanoke. The label was scrawled in graphite. Carmichael 9322, last harmonic, do not play. It was passed quietly between archivists, occultists, and federal handlers. Most were too afraid to listen. But one man did. Dr. Ellis Veit, an early audio ethnographer at Miskatonic University, transcribed what he heard in his journal before sealing the cylinder in concrete and abandoning his research. He wrote, "It's not a voice. Not exactly. It's a place. A cathedral made of layered sound. Like you're standing in an impossible hallway that moves when you breathe. There is a rhythm beneath the chant. A pulse, not a drum. A heartbeat, not human. And then I heard my own name spoken back to me, not aloud, in my mind, but with my father's voice." The recording was later tested at Bell Labs in 1951. Of the 6 scientists who listened, 2 went deaf within 48 hours, no physical damage to the ear canal. 1 disappeared. 1 began speaking in reversed syllables and died weeks later of self-inflicted injuries. 1 committed himself to a monastery in Iceland. And the 6th, he described what he heard as a blueprint for building a church out of memory, pain, and unfinished songs. The Frequency Cathedral isn't a metaphor, it's real, not in space, but in sound. A construct that exists only when the right frequencies are aligned. A resonance chamber formed by belief, trauma, and rhythm. Wakefield Hollow wasn't destroyed, it was translated. And if you hear the wrong recording, if your mind starts to hum a tune you've never learned, if mirrors warp and silence grows too loud, you're already inside it. The first child began humming on April the 4th, 1955, a girl named Inez, 6 years old, orphaned during the Peron purges, quiet, withdrawn. One morning, Sister Magdalena found her in the west courtyard, barefoot, eyes closed, standing in the chalk spiral left by another child's forgotten game. Inez was humming a lullaby no one recognized. Its melody was fractured, recursive, beautiful, wrong. She didn't stop for 7 hours. St. Ligea's orphanage sat on the edge of nowhere, just outside Tucumán, in the Argentine northwest. A decaying compound left over from Jesuit missions, it had housed displaced and unclaimed children for decades. The nuns who ran it weren't cruel, but they were superstitious. So when Inez's drawings began to change, when her childish scribbles gave way to perfect architectural cross-sections of a cathedral that no one could identify, they locked her in the prayer room. She wasn't alone in there. Over the next 3 weeks, 11 other children began humming the same melody, though none could say where they had heard it. They began speaking to each other in whispers, using a strange looping dialect. Not Spanish, not Latin, something older. When one of the older boys, Gabriel, was pressed to explain what they were saying, he simply replied, "She is coming to teach us the third song." Who is she? The one beneath the stairs, the one with no mouth and too many hands. On May the 1st, every crucifix in the orphanage turned upside down. But no one noticed, because every nun had fallen into a catatonic trance, their hands frozen in prayer, their lips whispering that same melody over and over, even while unconscious. And in the courtyard, the chalk spiral had grown. No one drew it, but every morning it was larger, more intricate, glyphs in its lines, angles that seemed to tilt the ground inward. One doctor, brought in from Buenos Aires, examined too. He spiraled and muttered, "This is not art. This is a circuit." The event reached its crescendo on Pentecost Sunday, when the children gathered in the courtyard just after dusk. No adults moved. No one tried to stop them. They stood in perfect formation, 11 children in a ring around Inez. She began to sing. It wasn't a lullaby. It was a sermon. And it was not meant for the living. They found the first depiction carved into the underside of a chapel pew. A crude image etched in nail scratches, a tall, faceless woman in flowing robes standing at the center of a spiral. Her hands, dozens of them, emerged from beneath the hem of her gown, each posed in different gestures of silence, fingers over lips, hands clasped in prayer, palms facing inward. The children called her La Madonna sin boca, the mouthless Madonna. She came in dreams. She came singing without sound. Inez described her as being soft like dust and colder than the dark inside your own head. But she wasn't afraid. None of the children were. They welcomed her. Because she didn't speak like the nuns, she didn't scold or instruct. She harmonized. Recordings taken of Inez's sessions were sent to Rome for analysis by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. None survived. Not due to sabotage. Not due to erasure. The magnetic tape itself unraveled during transit, fused, melted, or shredded from the inside. Even the few minutes that were captured held something unnatural. A Vatican audio technician transcribed the last audible phrase, "Let the note that birthed the world become womb again." Then, a feedback hum so low it reportedly cracked the playback machine's head. The mouthless Madonna wasn't a hallucination. She was a carrier, a transmitter, just as Carmichael had been. But here in St. Ligea's, the choir chose different instruments, not adults molded by regret, but children, blank slates, untuned strings. And Inez, she was the first to achieve resonance. Estate sister Magdalena would later describe before her own disappearance as the unmooring of her name from her body. She was still Inez, but the song inside her had never been human. Weeks later, local authorities were finally dispatched to the orphanage. They found no children, no nuns, no staff, only a courtyard of dust, and a spiral carved into the stone, perfectly smooth, too smooth, as though etched by heat or pressure beyond anything explainable. At the spiral's center was a child's molar, wrapped in red thread, still warm. It began with a fisherman in Salta, June 1955. He kept a battered shortwave radio beside his cot to track mountain storms, but that night at 3:11 a.m. the device emitted no static, no alerts. Only the sound of children, whispering, not crying, not playing, whispering, in reverse. He thought it was a prank, until the whispers spoke his name. Within days, amateur operators across the Andes, Chile, Bolivia, southern Brazil, began reporting identical transmissions, always at the same time, 0311, always on the same band, 17.78 MHz, a frequency previously unused. The whispers were layered, as if folded over each other, many voices compressed into one. Analysts who attempted to reverse the audio reported something even more disturbing. The voices weren't just speaking backwards, they were speaking in spiral. Phrases that began clearly but looped in on themselves, each syllable echoing with variations until meaning collapsed under repetition. One recovered translation from a signal recorded near Jujuy. We saw her eyes inside the note. We saw her note inside the eye. We saw the spiral see itself. Linguists couldn't explain it. Cryptographers couldn't decode it. The military tried to jam it. Nothing worked. Because it wasn't a signal in the traditional sense. It was a resonance field, the same pattern of harmonics found in Wakefield Hollow, now re-emerging 4,500 miles away. But this time there was no Carmichael, no chapel, no community, just disembodied sound, spreading like blood in water. One transmission, intercepted by a Vatican-linked observatory in Paraguay, contained a voice they did recognize. Inez, only older. She spoke in clear Spanish. The choir has chosen the third womb. You built it, you forgot. You called it radio. Now we return it. The mouthless woman had no need for temples anymore. The spiral no longer required stone or skin. The next sanctuary was broadcast. File number 27, Blackwood K, was recovered from a mislabeled lockbox in 1981. Its contents? A fragment of scorched journal paper, a broken hand-wrapped coil of copper wire, a diagram etched in graphite showing a primitive crystal radio receiver buried beneath the floorboards of the Blackwood farmhouse. The drawing was dated March 1879. But here's the problem. The frequency marked on the diagram's tuning dial, 19.78 MHz. The same band the Andes transmissions would occupy in 1955, a full 76 years before its discovery. The handwriting matched Elias Blackwood's sister, Ruth. Long believed to have died during the 1878 disappearance, this fragment suggests she survived, at least for a time. The accompanying journal scrap reads, "The signal hasn't left. It's beneath the soil, not above. We didn't bury the dead. We buried the choir. The wire helps me hear her whisper when the sun is down. The mouths are still closed, but I feel their breath in the coil." Analysts at the time assumed Ruth had gone mad, but two details complicate that. The diagram precisely matches later crystal radio kits from the 1930s, decades before they were patented. The copper coil, it resonates at exactly 17.78 MHz when subjected to subsonic vibration, even without a power source. And there's more. Spectral analysis of the journal fragment revealed traces of South American clay embedded in the page fibers, the same mineral composition found near St. Ligeia's orphanage, a connection never supposed to exist. So how did soil from Argentina get into a Kansas farmhouse 76 years before the spiral resurfaced? Simple. Time isn't linear to a song. A melody doesn't move forward, it moves in patterns, in returns, in refrains. The spiral isn't following history, it's tuning it. And now we face the terrible truth. The spiral didn't re-emerge in 1955. It was always there, waiting for the world to catch up. In 1963, a secret NATO listening project, Project Aurora, was launched from a deep Earth signal intercept facility beneath Kiruna, Sweden. Its official purpose? To track Soviet submarine transmissions in the Arctic Circle. Its real mission? To monitor anomalous low-frequency signals sweeping across the ionosphere, signals that didn't match any known human origin but appeared in spiral bursts. Across months, Aurora's analysts mapped the phenomenon. Not random, not natural, a global lattice of harmonics. At first, they thought it was seismic, then solar, then they found the voices. Tucked beneath the hum were faint vocalizations like old wax cylinders, children whispering, choirs humming, sermons folding in on themselves. In every region the signal touched, similar effects were documented. Sudden outbreaks of sleepwalking in children clustered around rural towns. Unexplained language emergence in isolated populations, words that no linguist could trace. Sudden phantom architectural visions in dreams, cathedrals of glass, salt, bone. A linguist embedded in the project, Dr. Noel Kirschner, connected the dots. It's not broadcasting to us. We're picking up the echoes of its movement, like whale song across tectonic plates. On July 4, 1964, Aurora captured a full harmonic convergence. All global spiral nodes, Wakefield Hollow, St. Ligeia's, Carmichael's last known coordinates, aligned for 7 minutes and 13 seconds. During that window, over 140 shortwave radios across the world turned on simultaneously. Each emitted the same tone. In each case, listeners reported identical visions: a spiral cathedral rising from red soil, choirs made of light, a woman with no mouth, holding out her hand. After that, Aurora was shuttered, files sealed, staff relocated. But a declassified memo surfaced in 2009, one last note from Dr. Kirschner. They are not invading, they are now not awakening. They are tuning us, preparing us to resonate back. The choir network is real. It spans decades, continents, bloodlines. It does not need temples or congregations. It needs listeners. And you've been listening. Since Kansas, since Carmichael, since the first hum in your bones that said, something is coming. October 1987. The Soviet Union is unraveling. Borders shift, files burn. And somewhere in the crumbling silence, a man begins to listen. His name is Anton Virilov, former signal analyst for the GRU, stationed at Vozrozhdeniya Island, an abandoned biological testing site in the Aral Sea. But Anton wasn't there for bioweapons. He was there because something strange kept happening near grid point 7K. Radio silence. Not interference, not jamming, absence. Even the most sensitive receivers picked up nothing but dead air. No static, no hum, as if the signal itself had been consumed. But Anton discovered something worse. When he left an old cassette recorder running near the center of grid 7KE, it didn't come back blank. It came back full. The tape didn't contain radio signals, it contained voices, faint, fractured, layered, some crying, some praying, some laughing, not joyfully but like the air was being forced out of them in rhythm. At minute 3:11, the voices aligned. They whispered a name, Virilov, Virilov. You heard us before you were born. He replayed it again and again, until he began hearing that same whisper outside the tape, in his sink drain, in the wind through shattered windows, in the buzz behind his own thoughts. His final report, smuggled out on microfilm, read, "It is not a god in the human sense. It has no will, it does not punish, it adjusts. We built radios to escape silence, but it turns silence into song, and song into signal. The choir does not arrive by ship or sky. It is grown in the hushed places. This place is not abandoned. It is a mouth." Anton Virilov vanished in November 1987, but his tape did not. It resurfaced in 2003 on an encrypted deep web archive known as the Hush sequence, shared only among fringe radio occultists. Its waveform, when visualized, matches the spiral glyph found in Blackwood's chapel, Carmichael's pulpit, and Inez's courtyard. 3 sites, 3 eras, 1 sound, and now a 4th site has emerged. A hospital wing in Nevada, condemned after a mysterious outbreak of sonic-induced catatonia. Our next destination, the Desert Pine Rehabilitation Wing, was shut down in 2007. Official reason, toxic mold. Unofficial reason, the walls were listening. Staff began reporting impossible phenomena. V machines syncing to patients' heartbeats in musical tempo, whispered confessions captured on unplugged intercoms, nurses dreaming of a cathedral with no doors, built entirely from red thread and milk teeth. Then came room 311, where catatonic patients began humming in unison, same note, same pitch, same time every night, 3:11 a.m. That number again. Dr. Meredith Shaw was the last to leave. In her final shift log, she wrote, "The sound isn't coming from the patients, it's passing through them. They are resonant chambers now, echoing something older than this building, older than Nevada." She tried to burn the patient files. They wouldn't ignite. She tried to record the humming. The tape degraded in 7 minutes, magnetized into unreadable spirals. We visited room 311 ourselves. It's quiet now, but if you press your ear to the east wall and wait, and hold your breath, you'll hear something, like a woman singing from behind the drywall. No mouth, too many hands. The same hymn that echoed in Kansas, Argentina, the Arctic, and a forgotten Soviet ruin. The spiral isn't done. It's just getting louder. This concludes our 4-part investigation into the spiral, the Blackwood recordings. But this is only the first verse. More signals are rising. More songs are returning. If you're ready to keep listening, if you're brave enough to tune your mind to what should not be heard, subscribe to this channel. New episodes will uncover what governments buried, what churches whispered about, and what you've felt vibrating in your bones since childhood. Like, share, and above all, keep listening. The choir is never far.